Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Evolution of Cervical Cancer Screening from Paps to Precise Personalized Programs. I am Kaylee Bach of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by BD. To learn more, please visit bd.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. I'd like to now welcome our speaker, Dr. Anu Rebbapragada, Director and Senior Advisor for Diagnostic Strategy and Services, Microbix Biosystems Inc. Dr. R., you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you, Kaylee. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today and talk about the evolution of cervical cancer screening. We're at an exciting time right now where we can harness the knowledge from decades and inform a more enhanced, personalized and precise cervical cancer screening program. My presentation today will focus on the cancer screening landscape in Canada, but I will also speak to the global improvements in cancer screening and the knowledge accumulated over the years. So let's get started. This is a brief disclaimer on the presentation. This presentation is on behalf of Becton Dickinson, and the opinions that I am presenting here are for informational purposes only and are derived from my research and studies. Here's an overview of the objectives for my presentation today. So I'll walk you through the evolution of cervical cancer screening. We've certainly come a long way from the time of Pap screens. And I'll highlight the landmark discoveries that have led us to this point today. Then follow that with a focus on the current state of the Canadian landscape. Excuse me, I see that my slides are not moving. Do you see my slides now? Great, thank you. Sorry about that. So moving on, we will focus on the current state of the Canadian landscape and follow that with the critical challenges we face, not only in Canada, but across the globe with cervical cancer screening and what needs to be done to achieve the goal of cancer elimination. And I'll then end my presentation with some solutions to address the various issues. And given the complexity of cervical cancer screening, access to screening, vaccination, and the changes as a result of vaccination, I'll try to put all the puzzle pieces together to elucidate what can be done to improve programs. And I hope the slides are advancing. So let's start off with the evolution of screening. And as the previous slide showed, it often feels like rolling a big ball up a giant hill, much like Sisyphus rolling up a giant boulder. But the challenge with HPV is not just rolling up one HPV. As you know, it belongs to a family of viruses, and we need to be aware of the risks of type replacement with the family of other high-risk viruses that may be present. Okay. So the history of cervical cancer screening really began in the early 20s when George Papanikolaou began his studies on vaginal smears. And really that was a landmark in itself, the ability to visualize these cells and pinpoint what are abnormal precancerous cells. As a result of implementation of the Paps screening program, the mortality rates with cervical cancer began to decline dramatically. And you can see the stats that are circled there in blue. From the 1930s to the 1980s, there was a dramatic decline in the mortality rate associated with cervical cancer in the US, from 36 women in 100,000 to only 7 in 100,000. But still, cervical cancer persists. The other landmark discovery was the identification by Dr. Harold Zerhausen that cervical cancer is initiated by infection with HPV, a virus. So really the connection between a virus as an etiological agent for a cancer was groundbreaking in itself and helped usher in a new way to look at cancer by looking at the virus, the causative agent for this cancer. And as a result of that discovery, there was a lot of work in new kinds of testing, new diagnostic modalities, the development of HPV-based tests. And as you can see, there were several iterations of tests that were approved over the years. The first high-risk HPV test was approved in the late 1990s. And after that, there's been a whole slew of new diagnostic tests that have come to the market with different features. And I will review some of the key design elements and performance elements that determine suitability for cervical cancer screening programs. In parallel, the field of cytology continued to evolve as well, and the Bethesda system was created. This helped with the classification of the abnormal cells and improved the triage and the follow-up of women based on the type of cellular abnormalities that were noticed microscopically. Certainly, the approval of the first HPV vaccine and against HPV 16 and 18, two high-risk oncogenic types, and 6 and 11, which cause genital warts, was a great step forward in preventing cervical cancer by vaccinating young girls who have not yet encountered the virus. And the field of vaccinology continued to improve with introduction and development of Gardasil 9, which now covers many more high-risk types, including type 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58 in a 9-valent vaccine. So there are many different streams of activity and evolution that have converged together to bring us to where we are today in 2022. And consequently, with these improvements came the recommendation to move to primary HPV screening instead of Paps cytology-based screening. And we'll walk through why those changes happened. So before we get to HPV screening, as I mentioned, Pap screening itself has evolved from a conventional Pap smear to liquid-based cytology. The advancement with liquid-based cytology, or LBC, is it provided a high-quality representative sample with better exfoliation of cells, better preservation, better visualization. And as a result, this improved the sensitivity and specificity of identifying abnormal precancerous cells. The limitations of the conventional Pap smear are well known now: variable specimen collection, limited number of cells that were transferred to the Pap smear slide, and this, of course, led to misdetection of abnormal cells and the low sensitivity, high false negative rate. In addition, contaminants such as blood and bacteria occluded the detection of abnormal cells on the slide. So in comes liquid-based cytology, which is now considered the gold standard for cervical specimen collection. The brush itself provides better exfoliation of cervical epithelial cells, better preservation of those cells in the medium in which it's collected. This also minimizes degradation and maintains cell quality. This certainly improves the visualization microscopically, but also preserves the sample for molecular testing by HPV-based methodologies. So really promotes not only cytology, but new kinds of testing, looking at HPV and perhaps in the future for other biomarkers associated with progression of cervical cancer. And beyond the collection of the sample, there's been advances in imaging and digital screening, which further reduce human error and subjectivity of how a cervical cancer slide is ranked. As I mentioned, the Bethesda classification for cervical squamous cells also improved the interpretation and reporting of cervical cancer and precancerous cells. So a much more precise way of identifying the types of cells and abnormalities observed microscopically. So now I will briefly describe the process of HPV infection and the mechanism of cervical cancer development. And certainly this is well known and well characterized, but it was a groundbreaking discovery that a virus was the trigger for cancer formation. And HPV is an unusual virus compared to some of the other sexually transmitted viruses like HIV. So HPV is also sexually transmitted. It gains entry into the cervical epithelium through breaks and tears in the mucosa and travels within the different layers of the cervical squamous epithelium. And here it establishes itself in the basal keratinocytes where it replicates. And most of this replication is episomally within the cells. It doesn't integrate yet, and it happily continues to replicate. Let's see, this slide advance. So it infects the basal cells. It continues to replicate at a low level. And really, the life cycle is considered to be quite stealthy. It does not cause high-level viremia. It does not cause cell death or inflammation, which are hallmarks of other kinds of sexually transmitted infections. It has a low level of replication. It creates more of itself by replicating and assembling new virus particles, which are then released and cause transmission. But overall, there is no profound immunological response. And as a result, HPV can linger within the host and establish latency. So the first step is infection, then is this transient state where it replicates freely. It is often recognized by the immune system and cleared at this stage, and most HPV infections are cleared within 6 to 18 months. But the ones that are not cleared by the immune system go on to establish latency and then persistence. But the key trigger to cervical cancer development is integration into the host genome. So the next slide will review that. And why this is important to understand the difference between transient infection and persistent infection and the key factors of progression is because this really underpins how the cervical cancer screening program is rolled out. And understanding the natural history of HPV informs when a woman is screened and what kind of triage and management programs are in place. So, as I mentioned, HPV infection is quite common and acquired by young women when they're sexually active. Some of these infections, most of these infections, in fact, clear within 6 to 18 months and are considered transient infections. Detecting HPV at this stage of transient infection leads to a lot of overcalling of HPV infection, which does not progress to any precancerous stage. So that's an important fact to remember. What's critically important is to detect women who are at the highest risk of progressing into precancer and to further steps, and really getting the sweet spot between transient infection and persistent infection is the hallmark of a good HPV-based cervical cancer screening program. So in order to determine what makes a good screening program, we have to first look at the HPV test itself, which is used as the primary screening modality. And of course, the test needs to have high sensitivity and specificity, but the sensitivity and specificity is not just analytical, but has to be clinical in its design. And what this means is that the sensitivity to detect both active and latent HPV infections that have the highest risk of progressing to cervical cancer or precancerous lesions. As you know, on the market, they're DNA-based tests and mRNA or messenger RNA-based tests. Messenger RNA-based HPV tests predominantly focus on active HPV infections where there's active transcription of the viral genome, and they're less sensitive for detection of latent HPV infections. As a result, some of these mRNA-based assays can miss abnormal colposcopy findings and miss those infections that go on to proceed into integration and triggering of precancerous states. And as a result, if any of these women go on to develop these precancerous states, they may require colposcopic management, and these could be missed. So the graphics below summarize the studies where HPV positive cases were missed when they were examined with an mRNA test versus a DNA-based test. As a result of many studies looking at the natural history of HPV and also comparing them to clinical findings, both in terms of cytology and histology, and prospective studies looking at progression towards cancer, we have a far deeper understanding of the natural history of HPV, and this informed the evolution of HPV assay design and the targets that were selected for HPV assays. The newer generation of assays focus on oncogenes E6 and E7 instead of the L1 region. The L1 region is part of the HPV genome, the surface of the HPV genome, and very interestingly, this portion of the HPV genome is used to integrate into the host, and the integration requires linearization of the HPV genome. And when the virus integrates into the host genome through the L1 region, it can lead to some deletions in this region. And as a result, HPV tests that focus on the L1 region as their assay target can incorrectly provide false negative results. So that's an important determinant. The other important determinant is what are the genes that are present in high abundance during active replication and later on in persistence when the virus is integrated into the host genome and triggering transformation of the cells. And E6 and E7 are the hallmark genes that are involved in integration as well as stable maintenance of that virus inside the host genome. And as you can see in the figure below, an abundance of L1 positive samples is seen during the low malignancy transient infection stage when virus particles are being created and released. But fewer L1 positive cells are seen. In fact, you see several cases of L1 negative cases where women have progressed further in the cancer pathway, where the virus has established itself, it's integrated into the genome. And you may see cases of SYN2 and SYN3 where the sample, the cervical sample, is HPV L1 negative. So it's quite perplexing, but this is explained due to the loss of L1 during integration of the HPV genome into the host genome. In contrast, high levels of E6 and E7 are present during later stages of the virus's life cycle in the host, and these are the stages that correlate with abnormalities that are reflected in either SYN2, SYN3, or high-grade squamous interepithelial lesions. So as I mentioned, the field of HPV testing has evolved considerably, both in how the assay is designed, in the platforms that operate the assay. One of the earlier assays was the hybrid capture 2. This was a HPV DNA test that targeted all genes of the HPV virus. It was approved in the US for ascus reflex and co-testing. Some of the drawbacks of this test was it did not have a cellularity control to examine how well the cervical sample was collected for testing. And it was quite a manual test with low throughput, so not amenable for high volume population-based screening. More tests came onto the market. The Aptima E6, E7 HPV mRNA test was on a high throughput automated platform, approved in the US for ascus reflex and co-testing, but didn't yet have a cellularity control to look at specimen adequacy. And later generations, this is the Cobas L1 HPV DNA test. So the difference here is it's targeting the L1 gene. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's some drawbacks and limitations with L1 detection. This test was the first to be approved in the US by the FDA for HPV primary screening. And it offered the added feature of genotyping HPV type 16 and 18. Later generations of the test, and now fast forwarding on to 2018, the BD on Clarity test targeting the E6 and E7 oncogenes of HPV DNA is approved for use in SurePath and ThinPrep. This is in Canada and in Europe. And it's approved for primary screening as well as ascus reflex and co-testing, so much broader portfolio of approval. It can be performed with automation. It has the cellularity control, so it is building on the previous foundation. But the new features are extended genotyping for detection of other oncogenic high-risk types, such as HPV 31, 52, and 51, and detection of other high-risk groups in strategic panels. So I'll describe why this is important in the following slides. But as you can see, HPV testing has changed from the early progenitor test, which only looked at HPV and did not provide any granular information on the type of HPV, and did not have the automation to really implement this as a population level program. The importance of this built-in control is twofold. One, that it minimizes false negative results. In the absence of detection of this endogenous or specimen adequacy control, a negative result may be due to poor sample collection. And this also is a useful feature as we consider testing of self-collected specimens, which may be another way to improve diagnostic access and achieve our goal of cervical cancer elimination. Okay. And the evolution of HPV testing and our knowledge of HPV's natural history lent itself to further refinement of HPV screening programs. As I mentioned, the original programs began with Pap smears. They moved to Paps cytology with liquid-based cytology medium collection. And as a result of all of the studies on HPV, the prospective evaluations, the clinical trials that examined the utility of HPV to detect precancerous lesions and offer early detection, there's been a change in the recommendations for how cervical cancer screening is performed. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force has updated their guidelines, and they've periodically updated them. And I've put here in as reference, in 2005, the recommendation was still to screen women aged 21 to 65 every 3 years with a Pap test. But by 2018, with all of the studies and knowledge on HPV, these guidelines were updated to screen, to offer 3 different screening options. One is to continue screening women aged 21 to 29 every 3 years with a Pap test. But then for women who are older, aged 30 to 65, the recommendation changed to screen every 5 years with HPV testing. And they maintained their recommendation to do HPV and Pap as a co-test every 5 years, but the recommendations continue to evolve with a clear lean towards HPV primary as being the superior way to screen. It offers early detection and a cost-effective way to screen for women who are at the highest risk of progression. And the key difference in the recommendations is As a result of the technological advances, we are able to now have a more objective, precise, and automated screening modality, moving away from the previous subjective, imprecise, manual way of Pap smears. And as we continue to evolve our screening programs, I'd like to keep these three parameters in mind: that we remain objective and improve the precision with which we identify early precancerous women at early stages of development of precancerous lesions, and we perform the testing and implement programs that enable automation and high throughput to really reap the benefits of doing this for a large population. Okay. And as I mentioned, the revised screening algorithms from the US Preventative Task Force and elsewhere globally have reflected on the clinical effectiveness of HPV, the high sensitivity for detection of SYN3+, compared to primary cytology or even co-testing, and also the higher specificity afforded by HPV. And together with the clinical effectiveness is the cost effectiveness of primary HPV testing. Primary HPV has the ability to detect more cases of SYN3+. So these are the really critical cases that have the highest probability of progressing towards cancer. And more importantly, HPV testing as a program was less expensive than primary cytology-based cervical cancer screening. And while co-testing can detect more cases of SYN3 than HPV testing, from a cost perspective, that co-testing requires screening of a lot of additional cases. As per this study, 100,000 additional cytology tests would have to be performed, and 566 more colposcopies at an added cost, a significant added cost of $2.38 million. To the cervical screening program in order to have just an additional detection of 14 more cases. So clearly 14 more cases is significant. And these are complex decisions that involve looking at the population of interest, and every demographic is slightly different. So cervical cancer screening programs have the added challenge of looking at the local epidemiology of high-risk HPV genotypes, the local rates of vaccination, and putting that together with recommendations for a screening program. This slide summarizes how advances in HPV testing, our knowledge of HPV's natural history, the introduction of vaccines, and the changes in cervical cancer screening programs have dramatically reduced both the incidence and mortality of cervical cancer disease. And yet you see that it hasn't gone to zero. As much as we've made great strides in our knowledge and implementation of new testing and screening and treatment, we have not met the goal of eliminating cervical cancer. There have certainly been many successes, but there have also been challenges in cervical cancer screening globally. The figure on the left shows the age standardized mortality rate in different countries. And as you can see, there's been dramatic reductions throughout the developed world, where there's been at least a 5-fold decrease in the mortality rate from the 70s to the 90s. But looking globally, there's another picture that emerges. There's many countries in underdeveloped nations where access to basic screening is still compromising the ability to detect early cases, and certainly preventing early detection and early treatment leads to greater incidence and mortality with cervical cancer. And as you can see, some countries bear a disproportionate burden of disease compared to others. And this led to the WHO to identify the goal to eliminate cervical cancer by 2030. And the reason that they've come up with this goal is that they recognize that HPV is a completely preventable infection if vaccination is implemented. But moreover, early detection and appropriate screening programs can catch any infections that have happened, that have been missed by vaccination, and early screening can prevent progression into cancer, and early treatment as a result of early screening can once again limit the women who bear the burden of disease and reduce the mortality associated with that disease. So this is the cancer elimination strategy articulated by the WHO. This was adopted in 2020. And the key pillars of this elimination goal is to have 90% of girls fully vaccinated with the HPV vaccine by the age of 15. 70% of women should be screened with a high-performing HPV test by the age of 35, and then again by the age of 45. And then 90% of women with pre-cancer treated, and 90% of women with invasive cancer managed. And while this seems to be a simple goal to achieve, given the complexities of HPV, access to HPV screening, vaccination, and treatment, this target is harder to achieve in some nations than others. The other key thing to remember is HPV vaccination alone is not enough. As I mentioned, the older Gardasil vaccine targeted only HPV 16 and 18 oncogenic genotypes. The new Gardasil 9-valent vaccine added 7 more types to that mix. But it does not target all of the high-risk HPV types that are in circulation. So we cannot be lulled into complacency, and this is a reminder to remain vigilant that not all high-risk HPV types are covered by the vaccines, and the ones that are not covered are rising in prevalence. So I'm going to zoom past this. This is the evolution of the HPV vaccines. We've gone from the 4-valent to the 9-valent. And while the 9-valent is now exclusively used in developed nations like the US and Canada, the women who previously received the 4-valent vaccine, who were girls at the time of introduction back in 2007 in Canada, they're not all protected from the other high-risk HPV genotypes that have now entered the screening population. So I'm going to move now and focus on the Canadian cervical cancer screening landscape. A lot of the data here is drawn primarily from Canadian sources, but I'll reflect on the US as well. So HPV vaccine access in Canada, this is a snapshot of 2022. As you can see, all of the provinces now have some form of an HPV vaccination program. Ontario was the first to begin back in 2007 with the school-based HPV program targeting girls who are 12 to 13 years of age. While the program was initiated back in 2007, adoption has been spotty with about 50 to 60% uptake across the provinces. Some have it higher than that, almost reaching 90% in terms of vaccination uptake. But the uneven uptake once again speaks to the need for early screening and HPV testing as a way to detect cases. So the current state of cervical cancer screening across Canada is quite important, and it's quite different depending on where you are in Canada. And these little dots are my little legend for the different types of screening that are in place. So the only province that currently has gone live with their primary HPV program is the little province of Prince Edward Island, and you see it here with the green dot. Other provinces are planning HPV implementation. So the province of Ontario is actively reviewing applications and is in the process of implementing this program by 2024, early 2025. Other provinces are doing Paps cytology with a reflex to HPV anytime there's an abnormal Paps cytology. Other provinces are now converted to liquid-based cytology. So Saskatchewan, who was on conventional Pap smear, is now on liquid-based cytology. But then there's far too many provinces that are still on conventional Pap smear, which have the issues of low sensitivity and specificity. And these include British Columbia and the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and even Quebec, and in the Maritimes, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So indeed, the majority of Canadian provinces are still on conventional Pap smear. And while there's an abundance of data and evidence from other countries such as Australia, Netherlands, and Ireland, where they've implemented HPV testing, they haven't yet made the leap over to anything beyond the conventional Pap smear. As a result, this is the picture of cervical cancer incidence in Canada. So this is looking at 2020 and onwards into the future. This is a modeling that was done by OncoSim. And here it's showing in the green line the status quo of cervical cancer incidence per 100,000. And as you can see here in 2000, it's about 7 per 100,000 women. And if we continue on the track that we're in with our spotty vaccination coverage and uneven implementation of HPV or even advanced cytology, we will continue to see cases of cervical cancer and deaths. If Canada adopts the WHO elimination goals of 90% HPV vaccination, 90% HPV testing and follow-up, then by 2050, Canada would be able to eliminate 6,810 cases and avoid 1,750 deaths. So this is quite a significant statistic and speaks to the need for advancing forward with not only vaccination, but better HPV testing and follow-up. Okay. So in addition to lagging rates of vaccination and HPV test implementation, COVID had a profound impact on cervical cancer screening. As the world was completely in the grips of COVID, women missed cervical cancer screening appointments. Here, the statistic from the US, by 2019, 23% of women were overdue for their cervical cancer screening. And in Canada, the same picture holds true. COVID profoundly impacted the delay in getting screened and also created backlogs in testing as laboratory staff were primarily occupied in testing for COVID. There was staff shortages and a backlog in cytology, Paps cytology testing and reporting. So the amplification of the challenges of cervical cancer due to COVID, is quite profound, and we will likely be bearing the burden of this delay for many years to come, due to increases in the incidence of precancerous lesions that might have gone unchecked because of missed screening appointments, missed colposcopy follow-up. And this can lead to further exacerbation of health disparities. For women who miss those appointments and miss their treatment, they're at a higher likelihood of progressing to cancer. And there's a lot of references here, but together these lines of evidence show that cervical cancer incidence is now threefold higher in vulnerable populations who have limited access to screening compared to the general population. And COVID amplified the disparity in access. Pre-pandemic vaccination rates were around 60%. And those rates dropped dramatically in 2020, 2021 to less than 1% in Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada. So once again, that's another way that the preventative measures against cervical cancer were impacted by COVID. And what this speaks to is a very fragmented system. The there's certainly a lack of awareness for the need for screening. There were challenges in access to screening. There were challenges in vaccination coverage. As a result, the late diagnosis and a fragmented treating pathway with lack of follow-up is leading to a rise in incidence and a rise in mortality. And this is something that we will continue to track to see the full impact that COVID has had on our system backlogs. The first thing I want to address is the systematic inequity and disparity in diagnostic access in this fragmented system. And as a result of this inequity, what has been identified is there's many women in vulnerable populations, rural, remote areas who don't have access to physicians, who don't have access to proper collection of a cervical specimen. And there's been many studies that have identified self-sampling, where a woman self-collects a vaginal specimen as a way to overcome this barrier for diagnostic access and physician access. And these are some articles that have been published. There was also a CADIT self-sampling health technology assessment. And this is the last one where they've examined clinician acceptability to use self-collected swabs as a primary cervical cancer screening method. And papers have also looked at the impact of the COVID pandemic on cervical cancer screening, and once again identified the utility of self-sampling devices, especially beneficial for people who face barriers to access traditional screening and primary care physicians. Challenges can include anything from distance, being in a remote location, lack of transportation, lack of time, paid time off, issues of childcare, cultural barriers, history of trauma. We recognize that cervical cancer cases are currently higher in certain populations, especially those living in rural, remote areas with low income and First Nations. And self-sampling could offer a culturally safe way, and a safe and accurate way to close the gap in cervical cancer screening. Many studies have now demonstrated that self-sampling is generally as accurate as clinician-collected samples for HPV testing. Studies have also shown favorable uptake, and this has now been identified as a solution to increase participation in cervical cancer screening and promote earlier detection. I'm going to touch a little bit on examples globally where self-collection has been explored and even implemented. In Australia, they're currently restricting self-sampling to individuals who are under-screened or never have been screened. And here the patients, the participants obtain a self-sampling kit and collect the sample in a clinical setting rather than in their home. However, in Netherlands and Finland, the person receives a mailed-in self-collection kit, and these individuals self-collect at home and mail their sample in for testing at a lab. And both in Netherlands and Finland, they're currently limiting self-collection only to individuals who are not participating in a physician-collected organized screening program. So this is another avenue for women to screen themselves. But all of these countries, Australia, Netherlands, and Finland, are all considering making self-sampling available to all eligible screening participants because they recognize the benefits of improving access, increasing participation, and the improved convenience that this provides for women. Certainly, there's challenges with self-collection, and these cover a gamut of issues from a low response rate, low number of completed kits that are completed and returned properly. The sample itself is collected with a swab and does not have adequate cells, so cytology triage cannot be performed. So a different reflex testing mechanism needs to be developed. There's concerns with privacy and packaging of mail-out kits. In terms of a system program cost, this can be quite costly to implement an entire mail-out program. So one mitigation strategy is an opt-in program where some participants request kits, and different jurisdictions are weighing the pros and cons and the cost benefits of a mail-out program versus a physician-based program. There's certainly regulatory barriers in having a self-collection program. First of all, HPV assays need to be validated and thoroughly examined for accuracy, clinical sensitivity, and specificity with self-collected samples, taking into account specimen stability and reproducibility with use of these samples. The next point I'm going to touch on, the other challenge is the one of type replacement due to other high-risk HPV genotypes and the value that extended genotyping brings to this issue. And here's a quote from Dr. Jeffrey Isaacson, who says, "If it's worth vaccinating against, it's worth screening for." And this quote is based on the 9-valent vaccine that covers several other high-risk genotypes, but screening programs don't typically identify those other genotypes and don't identify whether there's replacement occurring in our population with other high-risk genotypes. And then there's other quotes that reflect this, the famous one from Socrates: "You don't know what you don't know." And what I say is you can't find what you're not looking for. And the clinical value of HPV assays with extended genotyping is that they enable the tracking of genotype-specific high-risk HPV persistence. They can identify new types that may be emerging as threats. And they can provide more specific actionable insights based on the high-risk HPV genotype that is detected. And really looking at the different genotype enhances clinical management algorithms. They provide additional insight, and this can assist in reducing patient callbacks, unnecessary colposcopies, and really further refining the precision with which we are rolling out HPV cervical cancer screening programs and managing patients. And why does monitoring persistence, why is that important? So genotype-specific HPV persistence is really the most important determinant of cervical cancer risk in women who test HPV positive. So the ability to know that it's the same HPV genotype that has persisted at 2 different visits is a profoundly important tool for physicians to evaluate a person's risk for developing cancer. And here this graph shows, the orange line shows that persistent infection with the same HPV genotype confers the highest risk of developing cervical precancer. And the black line here is when you don't know which HPV type it is, so we can't comment on what that is. But what's very important to see is this bottom blue line that shows that HPV infections that clear between 2 sequential screening tests, or if you have a different HPV genotype between the tests, that indicates that the first genotype has been cleared by the immune system and the woman has gone on to acquire a new infection. And this is a very important piece of information, as this indicates that these women are at lower risk of developing cervical precancer. It indicates that their immune system is still capable of clearing infection. And so this continues to show what I've described in the previous slide. Screening assays that have partial genotyping that only focus on HPV 16 and 18 have an incomplete picture of what HPV types are circulating and what are infecting women. So a simple test will tell you it's HPV positive, but it doesn't give you the precise information of what HPV type is infecting. Tests with extended genotype can identify genotype-specific persistence beyond HPV 16 and 18, but they can also identify when a type switch has taken place and when clearance has taken place. So here, the ideal scenario is there's no HPV at the second visit and a woman has cleared infection. But the other good news story is when the original infecting HPV type is cleared and there's a switch in the HPV type, which indicates that the immune system has cleared the original infection, and really this HPV positivity is due to infection with a new type. The worst case scenario is when there's persistence of a specific genotype, And here, this has the highest probability of progressing to cancer. And this, once again, escalates the physician's management and the precision with which this patient is followed up. What we also need to be aware of is the emerging threats of new high-risk oncogenic HPV types and the changing prevalence of these types as a result of vaccination. And this is the concept of risk replacement. Many studies have shown that HPV-31 is emerging as a new risk for cervical cancer and is one that should be regarded as a critical high-risk HPV type in cervical screening programs. So there's many studies listed here, and they're all showing that the prevalence of HPV-31 is increasing, as you can see in this HPV type prevalence ranking column on the right. I'm going to focus on one study in particular. I like the graphics here. What they show is the preponderance of HPV-31 in cases of cervical precancer. So in this pie chart, you see here women with normal biopsy in the purple, and then women with SIN1, SIN2, and SIN3. If we look at the women who have SIN3, this is really alarming. There's really the dominant HPV type is HPV-16 that is driving SIN3 as expected. But then the next highest type is HPV-31, followed by all other 12 in varying proportions. And this is shown in this table here. Oh, sorry. In this table here, we see HPV-61, HPV-16 has the highest proportion found in SIN3 with 12.9%. But then that's followed with a fairly significant proportion with HPV-31. And this, once again, reiterates the risk of SIN3 by HPV type in women with normal cytology. So cytology is missing the risk for precancerous development, but the HPV test is able to detect it. And here we see that HPV-31 is the second highest in terms of HPV associated with SIN3. And any HPV that has a risk higher than 4%, according to the ASCCP, any HPV associated with SIN3 above a 4% risk threshold should immediately be referred to colposcopy. So with that principle, if we were to apply that ASCCP principle of similar management for similar risk, then women with HPV-31 should also be escalated for immediate colposcopy, given what these statistics are showing. These studies are fairly recent. They're looking at HPV types in women who are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And what's alarming here, this is a study done in New York City. They identified that non-vaccine types, high-risk HPV types, were higher in women who were vaccinated. So that was an alarming finding. Another one, this is in the Costa Rica vaccine trial. And they also identify an increasing prevalence of non-vaccine represented types in women who were previously vaccinated. And the font is pretty small here. I'm not sure if you can read it. UCC is the unvaccinated group, and then the HPV vaccinated group. And if you look to the far right of this table that looks at SIN3 cases, we see here that there's fairly high percentages of women who have HPV-31 and SIN3 in the vaccinated group. So this once again highlights the need for continued vigilance, even in women who are vaccinated, to have the ability to screen for other genotypes and identify risk from other high-risk types that can lead to SIN3. So what this is, I hope I've demonstrated with all the different studies and all the continuous improvements in HPV testing, in program delivery, in understanding of HPV's natural history, is that we need to continue to evolve cervical cancer screening programs. And this can be done in a variety of ways. Certainly the the guidelines that have been put out by ASCCP have continued to evolve in recognition of new HPV tests, newer ways to screen, the improved sensitivity and specificity of HPV testing. This is the old AASPP guidelines from 2015. As you can see, these are quite ungranular, for lack of a better word. Primary HPV screening, and if type 16 and 18 are positive, then women are sent off to colposcopy. If it's any of the other high-risk HPV types, then they're sent to cytology, and then there's a follow-up cycle that continues. Fast forward now to 2019, and these guidelines were released very recently. There's some key changes here, and the recommendations now are based on risk rather than the HPV result itself, which is rather nebulous and vague. Looking at risk provides a far more precise way of following up women and enacting colposcopy and expedited treatment when necessary. And so the new focus is on risk stratification and individualized management. And these consensus guidelines have several important differences from the previous guidelines. Rather than considering screening test results in isolation, the new guidelines, they look at not only the current results, but the past results. They look at the patient factors. They look at the history of all of the results in the context of that individual patient to create an individualized assessment of that patient's immediate risk for precancer, and then their 5-year risk of progressing to precancer or cancer. So this is a big difference in how it was done before, where it was a blunt tool looking at just HPV, but not looking at the totality of the individual or the type of HPV. And the new guidelines still retain the principle of equal management for equal risk. And the key focus now is to increase accuracy and reduce complexity for both providers and patients while maintaining a high degree of safety for patients. And what ASCCP has done is really embrace and adopt rapidly emerging science for the long-term utility of this screening program. So both the American Cancer Society and the American Society of Colposcopy and Cervical Cancer Pathology have recommended extended genotyping as a key parameter for an updated screening program. And why this is because it identifies individual high-risk genotypes that have a higher likelihood of infecting women, even in the era of post-vaccination. And it enables specific identification of these types and a more precise, personalized, individualized approach to screening and follow-up management. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So if you have a chance, go to the website for ASCCP. They provide information on their new web-based tool, as well as an app that allows physicians to enter in a patient's current HPV results and past HPV results in the context of individualized patient history with recommendations for follow-up. And there's different scenarios listed in the website with video examples that walk you through how the app works. Here are some screenshots of the app. Basically, it allows you to identify the woman's age bracket, age range, current HPV result, previous HPV results, cytology results, and the type of HPV. And based on that, different recommendations are provided for follow-up. So over here, the recommendation is for 1-year follow-up, and in the second example, you see immediate escalation to colposcopy, given the higher immediate risk of SYN3 for a particular HPV type. Once again, the type of HPV test that is used for screening is critically important, both in terms of its design and performance criteria. The Valgent criteria for validation of HPV genotyping tests have evolved themselves. Initially, they focused on clinical sensitivity and specificity of the test, but the current guidelines have extended beyond that. focusing on the high negative predictive value, which provides higher confidence for longer screening intervals with a HPV test. Early detection of high-risk HPV instead of precancerous cells by cytology is afforded by this high sensitivity and high negative predictive value, but also how the test is performed on an automated platform with reproducibility, consistent performance, and efficiency. The newer elements of the test design and performance criteria are the assay targets themselves for the viral genes, as well as the human endogenous control. The ability to have extended genotyping and detect emerging threats from risk replacement, the ability to promote individualized risk assessment and clinical management principles, and a test that is progressive and adaptable to new screening modalities such as self-collection, and the ability to perform new types of triage testing, whether they be looking at methylation markers or other host genome biomarkers for more personalized and precise triage for management of patients. So together, an integrated solution needs to look at the ability to do testing in a sensitive and specific manner, the ability to identify an extended panel of high-risk genotypes to track persistence and type replacement, and also offer a way to have new modalities of screening, including self-collection as a means to improve diagnostic access. So really, it's not just the test in isolation, it's putting it all together in an integrated program that enables accurate, acceptable, high screening coverage, overcoming any capacity limitations of the system, whether it be physicians, whether it be the ability to reach a physician or laboratory testing, and optimize how a woman is managed, which involves risk stratification to enable more precise management and to minimize invasive procedures, unnecessary procedures such as colposcopy and further treatment, when a woman can safely be followed up without these interventions. And really, at the end of the day, it's putting all of this together into a scalable implementation program so that it has the wide breadth of a population program. And beyond that, augmenting it with the digital tools for successful rollout, adoption, understanding of the program, with continuous education of why the program is evolving. This slide just summarizes everything I've said. And essentially, a strong system is necessary to overcome all of the challenges for cervical cancer screening. It's not just the test alone, but putting the test together within a program that has adequate outreach for both the physician and the patient, and provides the added features of extended genotyping to be vigilant and examine risk replacement, offers self-collection as a way to overcome barriers to diagnostic access, provides the ability to refine risk stratification and triage so we can evolve in patient management with more precise individualized management programs, and leverages digital tracking tools to improve follow-up of patients, as well as a better understanding and informatics of all of the data we accumulate with cervical cancer screening. So with that, I'm going to end. I think I'm a little bit over time, but hopefully we still have a few minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rebbapragada, for your informative presentation, your time today, and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, BD, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Unfortunately, since we are running short on time, all questions submitted today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you had provided at the time of registration. But before we go, I'd like to remind you that this webcast can be viewed on demand, and LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.